We continue Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, by continuing Timoleon, I think we're at when his single admonition was rejected and contemned by him, he makes a second attempt, taking with him Asculus, his kinsman, together to the wife of Timoleon, and a certain diviner that was his friend, whom Theopompus in his history calls Saturus, but Ephorus and Timaeus mention in theirs by the name of Orthogoras. After a few days, then, he returns to his brother with this company, all three of them surrounding and earnestly importuning him upon the same subject, that now at length he would listen to reason, and be of another mind. But when Timoleon began first to laugh at the men's simplicity, and presently broke out into rage and indignation against them, Timoleon stepped aside from him, and stood weeping with his face covered, while the other two, drawing out their swords, dispatched him in a moment. On the rumor of this act being soon scattered about, the better and more generous of the Corinthians highly applauded Timoleon for the hatred of wrong and the greatness of soul that had made him, though of a gentle disposition and full of love and kindness for his family, think the obligations of his country stronger than the ties of consanguinity, and prefer that which is good and just before gain and interest, and his own particular advantage. Well, perhaps the advantage of good and truth is greater than the outer advantage, so you are looking at your own advantage more in that case. Hedonism has different reflections, right? For the same brother, who with so much bravery had been saved by him when he fought valiantly in the cause of Corinth, he had now as nobly sacrificed for enslaving her afterwards by a base usurpation. But then, on the other side, those that knew not how to live in a democracy, SPQR isn't quite a democracy, and had been used to make their humble court to the men of power, though they openly professed to rejoice at the death of the tyrant, nevertheless secretly reviling Timoleon as one that had committed an impious and abominable act, drove him into melancholy and dejection, and when he came to understand how heavily his mother took it, and that she likewise uttered the saddest complaints and the most terrible imprecations against him, he went to satisfy and comfort her as to what had happened, and finding that she would not endure so much as to look upon him, but caused her doors to be shut, that he might have no admission into her presence, with the grief at this, he grew so disordered in his mind and so disconsolate that he determined to put an end to his perplexity with his life by abstaining from all manner of sustenance, but through the care and diligence of his friends, who were very instant, well, I'm sure that means insistent with him, and added force to their entreaties, he came to resolve and promise at last that he would endure living, provided it might be in solitude and remote from company, so that quitting all civil transactions and commerce with the world, for a long while after his first retirement, he never came into Corinth, but wandered up and down the fields, full of anxious and tormenting thoughts, and spent his time in desert places, at the furthest distance from society and human intercourse. So true it is that the minds of men are easily shaken and carried off from their own sentiments through the casual commendation or reproof of others, unless the judgments that we make and the purposes we conceive be confirmed by reason and philosophy, and thus obtain strength and steadiness. An action must not only be just and laudable in its own nature, but it must proceed likewise from motives and a lasting principle, that so we may fully and constantly approve the thing, and be perfectly satisfied in what we do. For otherwise, after putting our resolution into practice, we shall out of pure weakness come to be troubled at the performance, when the grace and godliness which rendered it before so amiable and pleasing to us begin to decay and wear out of our fancy, like greedy people, who, seizing on the more delicious morsels of any dish with a keen appetite, are presently disgusted when they grow full, and find themselves oppressed and uneasy now by what they before so greedily desired. For a succeeding dislike spoils the best of actions, and repentance makes that which was never so well done become base and faulty, whereas the choice that is founded upon knowledge and wise reasoning does not change by disappointment, or suffer us to repent, though it happen perchance to be less prosperous in the issue. And thus Phocion of Athens, having always vigorously opposed the measures of Leosthenes, who, when success appeared to attend them, and he saw his countrymen rejoicing and offering sacrifice in honor of their victory, I should have been as glad, he said to them, that I myself had been the author of what Leosthenes had achieved for you, as I am that I gave you my own counsel against it. A more vehement reply is recorded to have been made by Aristides, the Locrian, one of Plato's companions, to Dionysius the elder, who demanded one of his daughters in marriage. I had rather, he said to him, see the virgin in her grave than in the palace of a tyrant. Good father. And when Dionysius, enraged at the affront, made his sons be put to death after a while, and then again insultingly asked whether he were still in the same mind to the disposal of his daughters, his answer was, I cannot but grieve at the cruelty of your deeds, but am not sorry for the freedom of my own words. Such expressions as these may belong, perhaps, to a more sublime and accomplished virtue. Yeah, that's quite the approach. You're too repressive. So you go off and so the person's like goes off and kills people, and you want to give me what I want now, you know. It's not a funny situation, but sort of right. In that respect, of his thought rather than the deeds. The deeds aren't funny, but the grief, however, of Timoleon at what had been done, whether it arose from commiseration of his brother's fate, or the reverence he bore his mother, so shattered and broke his spirits, that for the space of almost 20 years he had not offered to concern himself in any honorable or public action. Well, not everything honorable is about the public, when, therefore, he was pitched upon for a general, and joyfully accepted as such by the suffrages of the people, Teleclides, who was at the time the most powerful and distinguished man in Corinth, began to exhort him that he would act now like a man of worth and gallantry, for, said he, if you do bravely in this service, we shall believe that you delivered us from a tyrant, but if otherwise, that you killed your brother while he was yet preparing to set sail, and enlisting soldiers to embark with him. There came letters to the Corinthians from Nicetas, plainly disclosing his revolt and treachery, for his ambassadors had no sooner gone for Corinth, and he openly joined the Carthaginians. And I say it with the G because Latin back then, and certainly Greek, never said it like a J. There's no J sound in Greek. Latin, there was in Latin, but not for the G letter. Negotiating that they might assist him to throw out Dionysius and become master of Syracuse in his room, and fearing he might be disappointed of his aim if troops and a commander should come from Corinth before this were effected, he sent a letter of advice thither in all haste to prevent their acting out, and telling them they need not be at any cost and trouble upon his account, or run the hazard of a Sicilian voyage, especially since the Carthaginians' alliance with whom against Dionysius and the slowness of their motions had compelled him to embrace, would dispute their passage, and lay in wait to attack them with a numerous fleet. This letter being publicly read, if any had been cold and indifferent before as to the expedition in hand, the indignation they now conceived against Nicetas so exasperated and inflamed them all, that they willingly contributed to supply Timoleon, and endeavored with one accord to hasten his departure. When the vessels were equipped, and his soldiers every way provided for, the female priest of Proserpina had a dream or vision, wherein she and her mother, Charis, appeared to them in a traveling garb, and were heard to say that they were going to sail with Timoleon into Sicily, whereupon the Corinthians, having built a sacred galley, devoted it to them, and called it the Galley of the Goddess. Timoleon went in person to Delphi, where he sacrificed to Apollo, and, descending into the place of prophecy, was surprised with the following marvelous occurrence. A riband with crowns and figures of victory embroidered upon it slipped off from among the gifts that were there consecrated and hung up in the temple, and fell directly down upon his head, so that Apollo seemed already to crown him with success, and sent him thence to conquer and triumph. He put to sea only with 7 ships of Corinth, 2 of Corcora, and a 10th, which was furnished by the Leucadians. And when he was now entered into the deep by night, and carried with a prosperous gale, the heaven seemed all on a sudden to break open, and a bright spreading flame to issue forth from it, and hover over the ship he was in, and having formed itself into a torch, not unlike those that are used in the mysteries, it began to steer the same course and run along in their company, guiding them by its light to that quarter of Italy where they designed to go ashore. The soothsayers affirmed that this apparition agreed with the dream of the holy woman, since the goddesses were now visibly joining in the expedition and sending this light from heaven before them, Sicily being thought sacred to Proserpina, as poets feign, that the rape was committed there, and that the island was given her in dowry when she married Pluto. And so, say divinized heroes, hence, I know this is what they said, but, I don't have to agree that every mythological reference that I hear is, being interpreted right. These early demonstrations of divine favor greatly encouraged his whole army, so that making all the speed they were able by a voyage across the open sea, they were soon passing along the coast of Italy. But the tidings that came from Sicily much perplexed Timoleon and disheartened his soldiers, for Hicetas, having already beaten Dionysius out of the field and reduced most of the quarters of Syracuse itself, now hemmed him in and besieged him in the citadel, and what is called the island, whether he was fled for his last refuge, while the Carthaginians, by agreement, were to make it their business to hinder Timoleon from landing in any port of Sicily, so that he and his party being driven back, they might with ease and at their own leisure divide the island among themselves, in pursuance of which design the Carthaginians sent away 20 of their galleys to Rhegium, having aboard them certain ambassadors from Hicetas to Timoleon, who carried instructions suitable to these proceedings, specious amusements, and plausible stories to color and conceal dishonest purposes. And a lot of people say, well, that's what myths are. Well, no, but certainly myths have, the use and the meaning was not, quite what people thought it was, right? They had order to propose and demand that Timoleon himself, if he liked the offer, should come and advise with Hicetas and partake of all his conquest, but that he might send back his ships and forces to Corinth, since the war was in a manner finished, and the Carthaginians had blocked up the passage, determined to oppose them if they should try to force their way towards the shore. When therefore the Corinthians met with these envoys at Rhegium and received their message and saw the Phoenician vessels riding at anchor in the bay, they became keenly sensible of the abuse that was put upon them, and felt a general indignation against Hicetas, and great apprehensions for the Siciliats, whom they now plainly perceived to be, as it were, a prize and recompense to Hicetas on one side for his perfidy, and to the Carthaginians on the other for the sovereign power they secured to him, for it seemed utterly impossible to force and overbear the Carthaginian ships that lay before them and were double their number, as also to vanquish the victorious troops which Hicetas had with him in Syracuse, to take the lead of which very troops they had undertaken their voyage. The case being thus, Timoleon, after some conference with the envoys of Hicetas and the Carthaginian captains, told them he should readily submit to their proposals. To what purpose would it be to refuse compliance? He was desirous only before his return to Corinth that what had passed between them in private might be solemnly declared before the people of Rhegium, a Greek city, and a common friend to the parties. This, he said, would very much conduce to his own security and discharge, and they likewise would more strictly observe articles of agreement on behalf of the Syracusans, which they had obliged themselves to in the presence of so many witnesses. Regardless of witnesses, keep to your word, right? The design of all which was only to divert their attention while he got an opportunity of slipping away from their fleet, a contrivance that all the principal Rhegians were privy and assisting to, who had a great desire that the affairs of Sicily should fall into the Corinthian hands, and dreaded the consequences of having barbarian neighbors. An assembly was therefore called and the gates shut, that the citizens might have no liberty to turn to other business, and a succession of speakers came forward, addressing the people at great length to the same effect, without bringing the subject to any conclusion, making way each other and bringing the subject to any conclusion. The lines are a lot more words than I'm used to. And purposely spinning out the time till the Corinthian galleys should get clear of the haven, the Carthaginian commanders being detained there without any suspicion, as also Timoleon still remained present, and gave signs as if he were just preparing to make an oration. But upon the secret notice that the rest of the galleys were already gone off, and that his alone remained waiting for him, by the help and concealment of those Rhagians that were about the hustings and favored his departure, he made shift to slip away through the crowd, and running down to the port, set sail with all speed, and having reached his other vessels, they came all safe to Tauromenium in Sicily, whither they had been formerly invited, and where they were now kindly received by Andromachus, then ruler of the city. The man was father of Timaeus the historian, and incomparably the best of all those that bore sway in Sicily at that time, governing his citizens according to law and justice, and openly professing an aversion and enmity to all tyrants, upon which account he gave Timoleon leave to muster up his troops there, and to make that city the seat of war, persuading the inhabitants to join their arms with the Corinthian forces, and assist them in the design of delivering Sicily. But the Carthaginians, who were left in Rhegium, perceiving, when the assembly was dissolved, that Timoleon had given them the go-by, were not a little vexed to see themselves outwitted, much to the amusement of the Rhegians, who could not but smile to find Phoenicians complain of being cheated. However, they dispatched, people would say Phoenicians, but I'm not sure how it's spelled. I'm trying to make it sound Greek, right? However, they dispatched a messenger aboard one of the galleys to Tauromenium, who, after much blustering in the insolent, barbaric way, and many menaces to Andromachus, if he did not forthwith send the Corinthians off, stretched out his hand with the inside upward, and then turning it down again, threatened he would handle their city, even so, and turn it topsy-turvy in as little time, and with as much ease. Andromachus, laughing at the man's confidence, made no other reply, but, imitating his gesture, bid him hasten his own departure, unless he had a mind to see that kind of dexterity practised first upon the galley which brought him hither. Hecatus, informed that Timoleon had made good his passage, was in great fear of what might follow, and sent to desire the Carthaginians that a large number of galleys might be ordered to attend and secure the coast. Now it was that the Syracusans began wholly to despair of safety, seeing that the Carthaginians, possessed of their haven, Hecatus, master of the town, and Dionysius, supreme in the citadel, while Timoleon had as yet but a slender hold of Sicily, as it were by the fringe or border of it, in the small city of the Tauromenians. With a feeble hope and a poor company, having but 1,000 soldiers at the most, and no more provisions, either of corn or money, than were just necessary for the maintenance and the pay of that inconsiderable number. Nor did the other towns of Sicily confide in him, overpowered as they were with violence and outrage, and embittered against all that should offer to lead armies by the treacherous conduct chiefly of Cleopas, an Athenian, and Pharax, a Lacedaemonian captain, both of whom, after giving out that the design of their coming was to introduce liberty and to dispose tyrants, so tyrannized themselves that the reign of former oppressors seemed to be a golden age in comparison, and the Sicilians began to consider those more happy who had expired in servitude than any that had lived to see such a dismal freedom. Well, some people would prefer happiness and slavery, but some people, when they would realize, would say no to that either. But looking, therefore, for no better usage from the Corinthian general, but imagining that it was only the same old course of things once more, specious pretenses and false professions to allure them by fair hopes and kind promises into the obedience of a new master, they all, with one accord, unless it were the people of Adranum, suspected the exhortations and rejected the overtures that were made them in his name. These were inhabitants of a small city, consecrated to Adranus, a certain entity that was in high veneration throughout Sicily. And, as it happened, they were then at variance among themselves, insomuch that one party called in Hecates and the Carthaginians to assist them, while the other sent proposals to Timoleon. It so fell out that these auxiliaries, striving which should be soonest, both arrived at Adranum about the same time, Hecates bringing with him at least 5,000 men, while all the force Timoleon could make did not exceed 1,200. With these he marched out of Tauromenium, which was about 340 furlongs distant from that city. The first day he moved but slowly, and took up his quarters betimes after a short journey. But the day following he quickened his pace, and, having passed through much difficult ground, towards evening received advice that Hecates was just approaching Adranum, and pitching his camp before it, upon which intelligence his captains and other officers caused the vanguard to halt, that the army, being refreshed, and having reposed a while, might engage the enemy with better heart. But Timoleon, coming up in haste, desired them not to stop for that reason, but rather use all possible diligence to surprise the enemy, whom, probably, they would now find in disorder, as having lately ended their march, and being taken up at present in erecting tents and preparing supper, which he had no sooner said, but laying hold of his buckler and putting himself in the front, he led them on, as it were, to certain victory. The braveness of such a leader made them all follow him with like courage and assurance. They were now within less than 30 furlongs of Adranum, which they quickly traversed, and immediately fell upon the enemy, who were seized with confusion and began to retire at their first approaches. One consequence of which was that, amidst so little opposition, and so early and general a flight, there were not many more than 300 slain, and about twice the number made prisoners. Their camp and baggage, however, was all taken. The fortune of this onset soon induced the Adranitans to unlock their gates, and to embrace the interest of Timoleon, to whom they recounted, with a mixture of affright and admiration, how at the very minute of the encounter the doors of their temple flew open of their own accord, that the javelin also, which their entity held in his hand, was observed to tremble. At that point, well, all the people marching before the statue, right? And that drops of sweat had been seen running down his face. Prodigies that not only presaged the victory then obtained, but were an omen, it seemed, of all his future exploits, to which this first happy action gave the occasion. And in other circumstances, he might have said, "Oh, it's tears." But, for now, the neighboring cities and potentates sent deputies, one upon another, to seek his friendship, and to make offer of their service. Among the rest, Mamercus, the tyrant of Catana, an experienced warrior and a wealthy prince, made proposals of alliance with him. And what was of greater importance still, Dionysius himself being now grown desperate and well nigh forced to surrender, despising Hicetas, who had been thus shamefully baffled, and admiring the valor of Timoleon, found means to advertise him and his Corinthians that he should be content to deliver up himself and the citadel into their hands. Timoleon, gladly embracing this unlooked-for advantage, sends away Euclides and Telemachus, 2 Corinthian captains, with 400 men, for the seizure and custody of the castle, with directions to enter not all at once or in open view, that being impracticable so long as the enemy kept on guard, but by stealth and in small companies. And so they took possession of the fortress and the palace of Dionysius, with all the stores and ammunition he had prepared to lay up to maintain the war. They found a good number of horses, every variety of engines, a multitude of darts and weapons to arm 70,000 men, a magazine that had been formed from ancient time, besides 2,000 soldiers that were then with him, whom he gave up with the rest for Timoleon's service. Dionysius himself, putting his treasure aboard, and taking a few friends, sailed away unobserved by Hicetas, and being brought to the camp of Timoleon, there first appeared in the humble dress of a private person